One of the most telling moments came at the very end before he opened it up to questions, and he's talking about that Wall Street Journal editorial and how pissed off he was about it. I mean, he was pissed off.
He was.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of the Inside the Issues podcast. I'm Alex Cohen.
And I'm Sara Sadhwani.
And per usual, we've got a million and one things to talk about, including this week, of course, marked Governor Gavin Newsom's big budget proposal. It is an annual tradition. Most of the media is focusing on the numbers and where things are being cut and where they're not. We happen to think there is a whole other story going on there that others have missed. We will fill you in on that.
Absolutely. And there have been some notable departures of leadership throughout Los Angeles, at the LA Times, at DWP. We are going to break it all down.
And I think it's safe to say that 2024 is brought to you by the letter C. That would be C for campaign trail and C for courtroom drama. Lots of it happening throughout the country, most of it involving former President Donald Trump. But Hunter Biden appearing in a federal court in downtown LA this week. And I think there's a real political strategy there as well. So with all that on the table, Sara, let's dig in.
Let's do it.
It's budget time. And I feel like, man,
Always
it's like, you know, when you start
January.
getting used to, this is a very old school thing because no one writes checks anymore. But when you start realizing like, oh, it's 2024, I'm writing that new year on my checks now. And I feel like, oh my God, all right, it's already state budget time. Here we go. And, you know, we headed into it, and we've talked about this before, knowing that after years of being super flush with cash, the state is now facing a deficit. One of the big stories that you probably saw this week is going into Governor Gavin Newsom's presentation this week, this number of $68 billion with the B was being floated about. That number came from the Legislative Analyst's Office. All of these are kind of guesstimates based on a lot of things. But in reality, the deficit, at least as Governor Gavin Newsom sees it, is smaller.
It is, right? And folks will remember that our tax returns were delayed here in the state of California due to that excessive flooding that we had last year.
So some wildfires,
right,
too,
and wildfires as well.
Yeah.
Exactly. So all of these natural disasters actually allowed for Californians to submit our tax returns later in the year, but that actually has budgetary consequences because then we can't really project exactly how much cash is going to be on hand.
Yeah,
it's one of those pieces.
And that was the 2023 part of it. I spoke with H.D. Palmer, an old dear friend of mine who has worked under many different governors on both sides of the aisle. He is deputy director of the finance department. And he said, no, that was the 2023 part of it. The 2022 part of it was some real volatility in the stock markets. And I think what people often forget is just how much of our state coffers at this point really relies on some of California's wealthiest residents, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of them were hit. I read one stat this week, a full 20% of our budget comes from the tech sector, and we've been hearing a lot about what's been going on, some rocky stuff there. So we had all these things coming together. But the state of California, it's not state of the state yet, but it kind of had that feel in the governor's budget presentation. And I think, Sara, this might be a good opportunity to bring in our weekly segment. What's the word? The word is
narrative.
Yeah. And the governor's narrative was, yes, you know, you see this, even if you go from $68 billion to $38 billion, that's still a really big number.
Money. Yeah.
Probably makes a lot of people start to panic. But he was like, look, there's still a lot of good that's happening here. And he wanted to talk about that. He talked a lot about keeping his promises, right? There's certain hallmarks of his administration to date, things like transitional kindergarten, that is being protected, health care for undocumented immigrants, that is being protected. But there are some things, if you kind of read the fine print on this very long budget proposal, things like the higher payments, hourly payments for health care workers, not going away, but it's going to be delayed because apparently there was some fine print there that all of that was tied to the state budget. And now that the state budget looking worse, that's going to be pushed back a little bit.
Absolutely. And anytime there's a budget shortfall, something has to get cut or delayed, right? And so,
or
I think, or both. And so we hear, Newsom laying out his plans for making those kinds of changes, possibly dipping into some rainy day funds.
Yes.
As you mentioned, delaying those minimum wages for healthcare workers. Those were increases, possibly some cuts to some of our climate change policies, but at the same time maintaining those commitments, especially around mental health care and the pushes that he's had for homelessness as well.
Yeah.
Because those are top priorities within the state and absolutely need that funding. However, there's all these other components to it. This week, the Wall Street Journal editorial board comes out with a scathing article about how the state of California is going to be increasing this wealth tax with a picture of Gavin Newsom on top of it.
And saying that Sacramento was doing this, I believe, was the headline. All right. So here, Sarah, I just want to point out here, because whenever the budget comes out, a lot of people look at it as a numbers story, the winners and losers story. And there's plenty of those out there. Go read them. They're great. They're fine. But you and I have been talking about this. I think that there's like this whole other story there that is going on. And this is the story about Governor Gavin Newsom's narrative, which I think is driven by a number of things. First of all, I would like to point out, I think the key to understanding who Governor Gavin Newsom is has to do with understanding how his brain works. I don't know what the man's IQ score is, but I would be willing to bet my last budget dollar that it is pretty high up there. He's incredibly smart and able to contain things in his head, which are just remarkable. Second of all, as we all know, he is dyslexic. And people talk about that in the kids' book that he wrote and all that great. I can't, as a person who deals with my own differently wired brain, it can be really hard to have those spaces where your brain goes super fast and there's other places where your brain just gets stuck. And one of my favorite moments, if you go back and watch his budget proposal, is he's talking about, someone asks him a question, he's like, oh yeah, I think that's on page 129. And I get a chicken salad sandwich if I'm right on that. And sure enough, it was page 129. And for a dyslexic with everything going on in his world to retain that, I just got to say, hats off to you, Governor Gavin Newsom. That's a lot. But it also, I think, that kind of wiring makes it almost impossible for him to do what most people expect out of politicians, which is to give those short, quick sound bites. And we saw that. I think the most telling moment of this budget presentation was, say, give or take, was somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 minutes, 2 hours. But one of the most telling moments came at the very end, before he opened it up to questions. And he's talking about that Wall Street Journal editorial and how pissed off he was about it. I mean, he was pissed off.
He was.
Let's take a listen.
You know how many calls I got about that? The damage they intentionally, knowingly do? I said it. They'll deny that, and there'll be 5 extra editorials attacking me for saying that. But they know that because every year I say that. Every year I say it. I don't know what more we can say. I think it's shameful because I think it's done very intentionally. It's not truth seekers. It's ideological warriors. And I say this as a guy who loves the news side of Wall Street Journal. I think it's one of the best. But that editorial board, it's a broken clock. They do it over and over and over again to damage this state. I have too much pride and love for my state. And I'm sorry to state it so emphatically, and I know I've done this long enough to know when you do that, you'll pay a price. But the state's been paying a price for the misrepresentation and lies that are advanced every single day about this state and the state of the state, the health of the state, its resiliency, its vibrancy, its entrepreneurial spirit, its energy. And so I'm here as a future ex-governor, loves this damn state, everything it represents, all its imperfections. And don't think for a second we're not honest and transparent about those imperfections. We're taking them on in historic ways, and we're trying everything we can flood the zone to address those issues. But one of the issues that remains in this state is, just the constant and never-ending assault on our values and the things that I hold, and I think the vast majority of Californians hold dear. So I'm for brand California, and I'm going to be a little bit more pointed, a little bit more aggressive in making the case. And some of the reporting around the last few weeks related to this budget and presentation, I think is done some harm.
So Sarah, let's talk about the narrative here.
Yeah.
Gavin Newsom has been out and about. He's debating Ron DeSantis, right?
Sean
on Fox
Hannity.
TV, right? He's hanging out with
Yeah.
Sean Hannity. He's doing all this stuff
Yeah.
where everyone's asking about him as potential future president. And then he comes back to California. And a budget proposal is one of those places like you have to be governor. You can't pretend to be anything else. This is his second term. He cannot run again unless he pulls a Jerry Brown and does it many years down the road.
Right.
And I think he told you exactly what he's going to do. And that's why I feel like understanding this part of his budget presentation is so important. He's doubling down on this notion of y'all might have a narrative about California and y'all might have a narrative about me and what I'm going to do. And I'm here to tell you, my goal this year is to crush that narrative.
Yeah. And I kind of love that, right? I mean, I love when he says, I'm brand California. Like, that's great. He is this pit bull for California, which we've seen him more recently be playing that pit bull role for Joe Biden and for the Democrats nationally.
He mentioned in the budget proposal Joe Biden.
But it left a lot of Californians saying like, hey, well, what about California? Because you're still our governor.
Yeah.
And here we see him coming back and really saying, I'm here, California, and I'm going to fix this situation, and I'm going to fight back against this false narrative being put out by the likes of the Wall Street Journal and many others. Of
the
course,
editorial board.
The editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. Thank you. And really fight back against that and stand up for what we believe in here in the Golden State. And I thought that was great.
It was really refreshing because I think it's not just about what we're doing here in California. I think it's about this bigger trend that we're seeing throughout our country for sure and throughout the world of really understanding what's going on and the difference between those sound bites or the clips you see on TikTok or what people are tweeting about who are angry Republicans talking about California's crime rate. That was another really interesting moment where a reporter was asking him about the money that he was putting towards retail theft and crime and whether or not he should be thinking about things like reform of Prop 47, which a lot of folks, especially on the right, have been hopping mad about saying, okay, ever since we made the threshold for the retail value of what you could steal, it's supposed to be around $950 to get bumped from a misdemeanor to a felony, so many folks on the right point to that as the reason why we're seeing smash and grabs and why businesses are leaving California. It's part of this whole big narrative.
Yep.
And Gavin Newsom, when asked about it, you could see that smile pass across his lips. It's like, oh, you want to talk about that? Let's go. And he started his own narrative in which he pulled up a graphic and talked about the different rates. Texas, their threshold is something like $2,500. And I know this is where it gets a little bit confusing. If the threshold is higher, that means that you can get away with the misdemeanor at a much lower threshold. And he said California was something like 10th or 11th when it comes to the threshold. So don't point to us saying that we're soft on crime. And again, I have to say as a journalist, it's really hard. It sometimes feels like this narrative coming up on social media is a tidal wave that you're fighting against because people love those, but Prop 47, but George Gascon, but businesses are leaving California, but I can't go to Vaughn's and get a bar of soap because it's locked up. It's hard to push back against those narratives, but there are actual facts out there that show a much different perspective.
It's true. However, at the same time, I mean, I think this has been one of the ongoing challenges, not just for Newsom, but in terms of crafting narratives, is while the facts may be different from the existing narrative, it's sometimes really hard for the facts to break through. People have this emotional connection to why their bars of soap are being locked up. And it's hard for facts to actually resonate, right, with all of us or with ordinary voters. And so that's always going to be a challenge. And I do think that there's something about Gavin Newsom's delivery, his like fire when he delivers it, that I think does help to break through some of that.
Yeah,
perhaps.
although the fire for sure, but sometimes that slickness that a lot of people refer to turns people off. But that's such a fine line. Like, how are you energized and impassioned without coming off as too much to some?
Right. It's a fine balance.
A really fine balance.
Yeah.
And one of the things that the governor also alluded to is that the people who help shape his narrative, that team is shaken up a bit. Reporter turned comms team person Anthony York is leaving his post. And there's I encourage folks to read it out there, an interview that he did with Melanie Mason over at Politico. As a journalist, reading about what it's like to cross that threshold from journalist to like part of the comms team and how he looks back at his own coverage. Yeah. It's a really, really fascinating read. But I'm going to use that as a pivot because Anthony York is not the only person in media departing from their posts, which brings us to topic number 2.
Yeah, some big news this week coming out of the LA Times. Yeah. I first saw this being reported actually in the New York Times. I was like, okay, New York Times covering LA Times. That the executive editor, Kevin Merida, is going to be leaving the LA Times by the end of this week. I mean, I think it came as a surprise to many people. Of course, Kevin Merida, longtime professional in this space, previously editor at Washington Post and ESPN. It was to great fanfare that he came to LA in 2021. So he hasn't really been there that long. And, has generally, I think, people have thought that he was doing a decent job at the LA Times, but clearly not all is well.
That's not the whole narrative, as they say. And there are some real pressure points that, some of them pretty obvious, right? That media is shifting a lot. And this has been a story for as long as I've been a journalist, right? Newspapers, which used to have a very solid, stable, unchanging business model of you sell subscriptions, you sell ads, there you go. That doesn't work in a world where people can get their news for free and where advertisers are going to influencers. Right. So many newspapers have been shuttering. Many of them are trying to figure out how to stay alive. And it sounds like Kevin Merida and the LA Times owner, Patrick Soon-Shiong, had some differences of opinion there, but also some differences on another topic. Take it away, Sarah.
Yeah, no, I think this is a fascinating thing because we've seen this new ownership of the LA Times. This isn't the first time we've heard about the ownership of the LA Times, most certainly. We know that of course, the owner, the biotech billionaire, Patrick Soon-Shiong, that his daughter actually has perhaps played an outsized role in some of the editorial decisions and in many of the endorsements of various candidates. It's been alleged that she's been very involved in that process. And recently, Merida made an editorial decision when some of the journalists signed on to a letter condemning the state of Israel's use of force in response to those October 7th attacks. Merida restricted those journalists from being able to provide coverage on the conflict in Israel and Palestine, and it was presumed that was not taken well by the Soon-Shiong family, and that this, in fact, might be one of the key components that has led to his ouster.
And it brings up some huge questions about who gets to shape the narrative. I think one of the arguments that Patrick Soon-Shiong made is that some of the folks who were told, okay, you signed on to this letter, and now you can't be a part of our coverage of the Middle East, were translators, right? And I think it's so hard. Again, I was brought up in a world where it was crystal clear. As a human being, you might have certain opinions about any number of controversial issues. As a member of the media, you don't let those bleed through at all. And I think this is one of those existential questions that we in the media have been grappling with for so long, because I think now we live in a world that some of these issues are so divisive. People know that reporters, journalists, editors, anchors, we are human beings.
Of course.
So is it better to pretend that you have no opinion whatsoever, or is there another route where you are able to express your opinions and strive really hard still to make sure that you are being as impartial as humanly possible? And I wish I could say I had perfect answers to these questions. I certainly
don't. I mean, we've talked about this also in academia, right? I mean, this is certainly our output, if you will, is different in academia than it is as a journalist. But I think many of the same questions arise because we have diverse classrooms that we are responsive to as well. So these aren't easy conversations. Merida, of course, upholding kind of that classic journalistic expectation that you're not going to be signing on to these various letters.
But meanwhile, creating a new narrative for the Times in that he is Black. And one of the other issues that newspaper has struggled with for many, many years is whether or not the people creating the paper were really reflecting the city that they are covering.
I think they might still have some of those issues, but we'll save that for another day. Right?
Absolutely. But I think, Kevin Merida was seen as the
bringing in a diverse voice to lead the helm. Absolutely. And there's been ongoing criticisms against the LA Times. And of course, they just recently launched their what is it called? De Los. Coverage of the Latino community and community issues. I think I've heard mixed reviews on that, but at the same time, they're making some strides. But you're absolutely right. This is an instance in which we're seeing Black leadership kind of being moved out. I can't help but feel some parallels on this one to this Claudine Gay story at Harvard that we've talked about in the past. Much of the starting point of some of this pressure point, of course, being this conflict in Israel and Palestine and how that's going to be played out, what the culture and narrative about that will be for their various institutions. Obviously, there's all sorts of contextual differences.
And the impact, right? Because, for now, if you have a Black leader of this newspaper, much like the first Black leader at Harvard University, and then that person steps down and leaves, how does that influence the search, not only of the person to replace them, but every future search for the leader? Do they look at, well, we hired a Black woman at Harvard. How did that turn out? Folks are making that argument, and they might well do that at the LA Times, which is, really disturbing on a lot of levels. And I think the same can be said. We can bring in now the other big departure this week at the LADWP of Cynthia McLean-Hill, who is the board president there. I had a chance to talk with her when she first took on this position, and the statement that she made around that same, or I'm sorry, it wasn't the statement that she made at that time, but it was not long before that. Talking about race at work, she said, is uncomfortable for most people. But for Black people and for many of people of color, it comes with a very real fear that they will, one, be labeled as angry, or two, that they'll have to quietly listen to racist statements, sometimes uttered in ignorance, sometimes not. And quite frankly, that they might lose their jobs. Again, I haven't seen anyone go back to that statement, but I think, wow, that's really powerful to think about. Now, the reason why she is stepping down from that job is, at least on the surface, not because of racism. No. Do you care to explain what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, so there's multiple pieces going on here. In particular, LA Times reporting recently about some ethics concerns. Yet again, here we go, LA City. Additional ethics considerations that she and another former member of the commission board attempted to have. Well, they had a private conversation with two cybersecurity executives in order to award them a new contract. This is, of course, prohibited. City contracts have to be publicly discussed, and there has to be a fair process. That doesn't look like she upheld that requirement. There have also been sexual harassment allegations that have been brought against her, or the handling of sexual harassment allegations as the board president as well. So there's numerous kinds of pieces going on there. There's also all sorts of turmoil happening within DWP. We had talked about it on the podcast several months ago. Another commissioner, mysteriously, Mayor Bass had asked Cynthia Ruiz, first Indigenous member to serve on this board. And of course, we're talking about water and water rights. And there's all sorts of implications for local Indigenous communities when it comes to these water rights being removed very suddenly from her position. Some of the speculation was that Cynthia McLean-Hill had something to do with pushing her out, perhaps. Similarly, the current general manager, mysteriously now,
Marty Adams.
Is bringing an early retirement as well.
And I got to say, it's just all really interesting. At the end of last year, I moderated and emceed an event sponsored by the LADWP all about women in roles of leadership, the many challenges that they face, especially women of color. Cynthia McClain-Hill was there. Marty Adams was there. Again, I just, totally different than Claudine Gay, and yet there's a lot of similarities, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens with that post and what happens with the post at the LA Times. Totally different. Totally different subject here, but also a huge news story this week. And I just want to timestamp here. We are talking just a couple of hours before Hunter Biden is set to appear. An arraignment for these tax charges. Just a quick recap here is 3 felonies, 6 misdemeanors about taxes that Hunter Biden, the president's son, did not pay. This was when he was in the throes of substance abuse and addiction. He has since paid those taxes. And every lawyer friend that I've talked to has been like, any other situation in the world, you would never, that's like it. You paid the taxes. We're good.
Yeah.
But
and there had been a plea deal, I think, over the summer that fell through all of a sudden.
Absolutely, right? And there have been a lot of concerns that plea deal falling apart was because of the political pressures Republicans were putting on this judge to make sure that Hunter Biden did stay in the news. Now, here's where the narrative comes into play. The vibe I'm getting is Hunter Biden has had some kind of moment where he said, okay, you want me to stay in the news? I will stay in the news. I'm going to do it my way. So in case you missed it, if you're listening to this podcast, I'm guessing you might not have. Hunter Biden made a very unexpected appearance earlier this week. There were these 2 different congressional committees that were meeting, having hearings about whether or not Hunter Biden should be held in contempt of court. And much like Donald Trump, who did not need to show up at the courtroom in New York on his civil fraud trials, that was his decision. And I think a very smart one in terms of campaigning, right? He's good in Iowa. Go to the courtroom. Hunter Biden did not have to be in Congress, was not expected to be in Congress.
And to get in front of that narrative, right? I mean, that's the piece, right? Is like you show up when you don't need to be there. You are now the story. Like your presence becomes the story.
No doubt. And it certainly did on that day. I want to note there was an LA Times piece about a very close associate of Hunter Biden's, a guy by the name of Kevin Morris, who's an entertainment attorney. Had a really interesting career, and much like Hunter Biden, has struggled with addiction and substance abuse. I think they really forged a friendship based on that. Kevin Morris now making a documentary about Hunter Biden. He was there when Hunter Biden showed up last time, surprise, in Washington, D.C. I don't know whether or not he was there this week in Washington, D.C., but what I do know is Hunter Biden shows up and everyone kind of went
bananas.
Bonkers bananas. Oh my gosh. It was just these crazy moments where the Democrats, made this really strong case. You want him, you want to hear from him, he is here. And why the heck would he appear in private considering Marjorie Taylor Greene was showing dick pics last time, right? Of course he's going to try to make this public to try to preserve some sense of decorum. Republicans freaking out. Nancy Mace of North Carolina saying, I was watching this live on television and I was like, oh my God, did she just say this? She was like, you and your white privilege, you've got some balls showing up. I don't know if the word balls has ever been used in that context on Capitol Hill. And then Hunter Biden, who's seen there with his buddies kind of grinning, like, bring it. And Sarah, here's just my 2-cent theory. The Biden campaign, re-election campaign, has to know that Trump is coming at them all guns a-blazing, right? And you got to fight fire with fire. And yet, Biden is president. There's certain things that he can and can't do. He's not been weighing in on these legal challenges.
No, he's been pretty silent on them.
Really silent about them. But can his son go out and do stuff?
Of course, he's the one, on trial here, essentially, right? Yeah. So it is up to him to defend himself. And quite frankly, it would look a little odd if Joe Biden is defending his grown son in some regards, right? So it is up to Hunter Biden, I think, to defend himself. But that could be a campaign strategy too, right?
Yeah. Okay, so here's so someone asked me this week. I have an answer. I'm curious what yours is. What do you think President Biden made of Hunter Biden's surprise appearance on Capitol Hill?
My guess is secretly he was really excited about it.
Right? Exactly what I said. I was like, as a president, he was like, As a dad, I think he was super proud.
Yeah.
Right? And of course, like a big narrative in all this, too, is Hunter Biden's addiction. Apparently, people were chasing after him in D.C. asking, hey, Hunter, what kind of crack do you like to do? And Jill Biden has come out saying, like, you all might think this is fun and games on social media. Like, this is impacting my grandchildren.
Yeah.
And it's ugly and it's nasty and it kind of needs to stop.
It needs to stop. I mean, addiction is a very real thing. Obviously, I mean, we just had Matthew Perry, right, who died in his hot tub, right? Like, addiction is a very serious issue. Hunter Biden is trying to be his best self, it appears. Like, do we really need to go there? I get that they're going after him for political points. They can make a punching bag out of Hunter Biden, but is it really necessary to lay in on this?
And how will it resonate with voters, I think, is the real question. And I think there are two different narratives, too. I think some Americans will look at this, and I think that there are some people who may have not firsthand or even secondhand dealt with addiction and recovery who will look at it and it's like, who will just think do better, right? Yeah. I'm not addicted to crack. I didn't do all that. I paid my taxes.
Some people will take the moral high ground on this. Absolutely. Sure. And it's easy to make a punching bag out of him in that if that's your perspective.
And others will say, look at how much he's turned his life around.
Exactly.
Look at the things he's doing.
It's the redemption story.
Right? And look at how he's putting himself out there. Yeah. So super, super fascinating. And we will keep an eye on which narratives the voters will choose. We've got one final thought on narratives, and this is based on some interesting news we heard this week. It seems that Selena Gomez, who I adore,
Me too.
will be playing Linda Ronstadt, who I actually hated as a kid growing up. I thought her music was dreadful. My parents played it all the time. Sorry. But there's going to be this biopic about Linda Ronstadt with Selena Gomez. So, of course, for anybody who is anybody in California politics or who covers California politics, is wondering, okay, who's going to play Jerry Brown?
Right, because there was a hot romance love affair.
A big deal back in the day. So there were some Politico reporters who were talking about cousin Greg from Succession. I think he's too tall.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it might be, and too dorky.
He's so dorky.
That's not Governor Newsom.
So. Who do you have? Who's your?
Okay, so I also saw someone put a picture back to back of him and Luke Wilson, which I actually like, just facially totally works.
I could see that.
But I just was recently rewatching the film Knives Out, which I love and adore. Mm-hmm. Chris Evans is in that film. And I think there's a certain confidence and cockiness about Chris Evans. And facially, they kind of look alike. So Chris Evans is who's got my vote. Do you have anyone?
Well, I don't know. You know, I think I have Barbie on the brain. So for me, I was like, I bet Ryan Gosling could do this. If he can play Ken, he could also be Jerry Brown. I don't know. We'll see.
Or if it's Jeremy Allen White, I would watch that man read a phone book, especially if it's in Calvin Klein. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google it, and I will leave it there. Before I get any more hot and bothered, we are going to close out this edition of the Inside the Issues podcast. If you've got thoughts about who should play Jerry Brown in the biopic, what's going on with Hunter Biden, Governor Gavin Newsom's brain, and how that influences his politics, we would love to hear from you. You can find us on social media. I am there at Alex Cohen in LA.
And I'm at Sara Sadhwani.
See you next week. The Inside the Issues podcast is a Spectrum News One production. Crystal Goss is our producer. Our senior digital producer is Yasmin Cruz. Nathaniel Leathers is our editor, and the executive in charge of production is Daisy Espinoza.